It's very appropriate for me that we're here today at TEDxSquareMile and that the theme is the power of purpose, because luckily that's exactly what I want to talk about, what purpose means in this particular square mile, the City of London. So what is the point of the city? What's it for? Well, it's obviously one of the world's great financial centres, and it's one of the major drivers of the UK economy. But is that it? Is it just about making money? Well, if you ask these guys, they'd probably say, yes, clearly, and they probably wouldn't do it in very polite terms. And maybe that's at the root of a lot of the image problems that the city's had in recent years. But it doesn't have to be like that. When you look at the history of the city, it's been about a lot more than just making money. And I want to argue today that it can be again. So perhaps the main way in which people in the city have demonstrated that sense of purpose through the ages has been through philanthropy. And that shouldn't really be too much of a surprise. Philanthropy, to my mind, is all about purpose. That's what makes it different to just straightforward charity. Charity focuses on the act of giving and how it makes you feel, whereas philanthropy is about what you want to achieve with that giving. It's about being passionate about something and sharing it with other people, or it's about being angry about something and wanting to change it. Now, obviously, rich people don't have a monopoly on having a purpose. It's open to all of us to have a purpose. And so they don't have a monopoly on philanthropy either. We can all be philanthropists. And to be honest, I would argue we all should be. But it still does make sense to focus on the city like I'm doing for at least two good reasons. The first one is very practical. When the bank robber in the US, Willie Sutton, was arrested and they finally got round to asking him, why do you rob banks? He looked at them and said, well, that's where the money is. So, you know, the same's true of philanthropy. The city is where the money is, so it does make sense to look there. But more than that, the city's all about creating wealth, and people who've made their own money rather than inheriting it, in general, tend to have a slightly more positive attitude towards the idea of giving it away, and there's a lot of research that shows that. One of the most striking examples I've come across of this was a 19th century banker called Baron Maurice de Hirsch. Now, he's a really interesting figure, de Hirsch. He was from a very wealthy family himself. His dad was the banker to the King of Bavaria. And he went on to make a fortune in his own right in the city, but he quickly decided he had plenty of money already. He didn't need it. He wanted to use it to help other people. But he had one small problem, which was that his real love in life was gambling, and particularly on horses. And he didn't really want to give that up. So he came up with a novel solution. He'd continue to make money, and he'd continue to bet it on the GGs. But he'd give all of the money that he made away to charity, particularly to a few local London hospitals. Now, for a bad gambler, that probably wouldn't sound like much of a promise, but luckily, de Hirsch was a phenomenally good gambler, so it actually turned out to be an incredibly successful strategy. And this led to the peculiar sight, by all accounts, of workers in London charities at the time furiously studying the racing form and the racing results and celebrating uproariously when one of de Hirsch's horses came in, which more often than not they did. And it's estimated throughout the course of his life he gave away over £20 million, which in today's money is a vast, vast sum. So if people who have made their own money are more likely to want to give it away, surely there's no problem. The city's already a hotbed of philanthropy, right? Well, unfortunately, no. There are certainly some very generous individuals in the city, and I've met quite a few of them in the course of my work, and they're very inspiring, but they're still outliers rather than indicating a sort of deeper-seated culture at the moment. And that certainly hasn't always been the case. Back in Tudor times in London in the 1600s, Tudor merchants used to compete with each other to see who could get the best eulogy when they died. They really wanted people to say nice things about them once they were gone. And one of the best ways of achieving that was to make sure you gave a lot of money to charity and, more importantly, made sure everybody knew about it. And that competition amongst London merchants had impacts far beyond the confines of the City of London. So other merchants around Britain started to read these eulogies and copy the charitable exploits of London merchants in order to try and get better eulogies for themselves when they died. And this idea of philanthropy as a kind of social norm reached its pinnacle in the Victorian era. So you can see here in 1850, the Times ran a very grand editorial in which it basically said philanthropy was the defining characteristic of the English people. And this culture of giving, particularly in the city, gave rise to some of the greatest philanthropists that Britain's ever known. So Back in the Tudor era, we had men like Thomas Gresham and Thomas Sutton. And then later in the Victorian era, people like the American financier George Peabody and Angela Burdett Coutts, who very much the first lady of philanthropy. And her charitable interests, for example, spread all across the globe and around Britain as well. And she was even dubbed the Queen of Baltimore for the work that she did with fishermen in that part of the US. And these great philanthropists have left behind great legacies. So we can see in the buildings, many of them that are around us in London today, places like Columbia Road Market, which Angela Burdett Coutts gave the money for, and also in institutions that they founded. Now, I don't want to suggest that these great and generous philanthropists only gave because they were worried about what other people thought, or there was some sort of social norm expectation to do so. That was an important part of it, undoubtedly, but it wasn't the whole story. The other thing that was very important is they were really aware of the needs around them in society. For a philanthropist in the Tudor era or the Victorian era, you know, there were a whole host of causes they could choose from. There were a lot of problems in society at those times. And they couldn't really fail to be aware of them. They were right there in front of them when they opened the door or when they went to work and walked along the streets. So we can see here, you know, in London in particular, rich and poor really lived totally cheek by jowl, and wealthy people just couldn't ignore what was going on around them in wider society. One of Charles Booth's poverty maps, where you've got red areas are rich and blue areas are poor, show quite how on top of each other rich and poor were. And city workers were almost literally tripping over destitute and poor people in the streets. It was absolutely terrible. And, you know, this did give rise to positive outcomes. So a great philanthropist, Thomas Coram, who founded the Foundling Hospital not very far from here, was apparently driven to do so when he was walking to work in the city one day. And he came across a mother literally in the act of abandoning her child in the street. And he decided, I can't ignore this any longer. This can't stand. I have to do something. And he dedicated his whole life to the problem of abandoned children. But I don't want to suggest that today's city workers somehow have hearts of stone, and if they came across somebody abandoning their child in the street, they wouldn't care about it. That's obviously not true. The problem nowadays is that city workers quite often are just never presented with these sorts of situations and made aware of the causes that are around them in wider society. A lot of them live in wealthy areas of London, or they live in commuter towns outside. They come in, they go to work, they work very long hours, they go home, and they never really see how the other half lives in the problems of wider society. And there's research from the US that shows that when wealthy people live in areas that aren't very economically diverse, they're less likely to give to charity. That's just how it is. Now, I'm not suggesting it would be better if the streets were littered with paupers and people were dying out in the open. That would obviously be terrible. But it does show that you need to get that physical connection of people with causes. And people who are trying to develop a culture of philanthropy in the city know this. So a lot of corporate philanthropy programs start from the idea that you need to get a sort of seeing as believing approach. So you connect people with a cause by taking them to see the work of a charity or a community group. And that often leads to a very deep connection between people and causes that leads on to sort of years of giving. So is purpose, when it comes to the city, all about philanthropy? It might sound like I'm saying it is. Well, I don't think it is quite. And the past in the city, people knew this. They knew it wasn't just about making money and then giving it away. The way in which you make money can also have a purpose. So take, for example, a man like George Cadbury, a very famous name. He gave us dairy milk and chocolate buttons, so he's obviously great already. But it turns out he's also one of our greatest ever philanthropists. But much more than that, Cadbury saw no dividing line really between philanthropy, business, or politics. They were all just tools to him that he used to fulfill his wider purpose, which in his case was driven by his Quaker faith. But he, in his business, introduced many far-reaching employment reforms that still have echoes today, as well as being a very well-developed philanthropist. And we're starting to see people rediscovering these sorts of ideas now. So responsible business initiatives all popping up all over the place. And even beyond that, things like social enterprise, which puts social purpose right at the very heart of business, are very encouraging. And the city has a particular role it can play here, because it's all about making money and moving money around. So one of the ideas that is gaining some currency at the moment is social investing, or impact investing as they call it in the US, which is basically about investing money to make a financial return, but also to do social good at the same time. And this is obviously something the city could do very well. But it might not surprise you to hear me say at this point that social investment's not actually a new idea. Way back in the 1600s, a guy called Thomas Firmin, who was a very well-known merchant at the time in London, had an idea to set up a series of businesses which would employ poor weavers and spinners who couldn't get work elsewhere. Now, he knew there was no way to make these businesses profitable, and he decided he didn't care. He would just cover the difference between the loss and what it should be making out of his own philanthropic money, and he'd treat it as a sort of hybrid of business and philanthropy. And he wanted to show that this approach could work, and he particularly wanted to convince government that it could work. Unfortunately, Firmin turned out to be quite a long way ahead of his time, and government wasn't really interested. But people now are starting to cotton on to that idea that you can combine profit and purpose successfully. And also people are starting to rediscover that philanthropy in the city is an incredibly powerful tool for purpose. But there still is a long way to go to get back to matching the achievements of past generations. Now, as I've said, I'm not suggesting it's as simple as just turning back the clock. I don't think we want to be more like the Victorians. I think that would be a very bad idea for a lot of reasons. We don't want to reintroduce workhouses or that kind of grinding poverty. But the fascinating thing about the history of the city is it does show that when the city has that broader sense of purpose that's about more than just making money, it can be an incredible force for good in society as well as the driver of the economy. And I think that's an idea that's really worth taking on board. Thank you.